Staff Sergeant Marcus "Tank" Rodriguez was cutting into his medium-rare steak at Romano's Steakhouse when restaurant manager Kevin Walsh decided to turn a quiet Friday evening into the worst business decision of his career. The 34-year-old Marine veteran had chosen a corner table where his service dog, a German Shepherd named Gunnar, could lie quietly beside him without blocking foot traffic, both of them trying to enjoy the first restaurant meal Marcus had attempted since his medical discharge 6 months earlier after an IED explosion in Helmand Province left him with traumatic brain injury and severe anxiety attacks. What Walsh didn't know, couldn't have known, really, was that Marcus had served 3 tours in Afghanistan with the 2nd Marine Expeditionary Force, that Gunnar was a certified PTSD service animal who'd been trained to detect panic attacks and provide tactical support during flashbacks, and most importantly, that it was Friday night at Camp Lejeune, when 200 Marines from Marcus's old battalion were celebrating the end of field exercises with their traditional dinner at Romano's. "Sir, I'm sorry, but we don't allow pets in the dining room," Walsh announced loudly enough for the entire restaurant to hear, clearly intending to make an example of what he perceived as a veteran trying to game the system. "You'll need to take your dog outside or leave." Marcus looked up from his steak, noting the way every conversation in the restaurant had stopped as patrons turned to watch the confrontation. He'd been making progress with his PTSD therapy, but public scenes still triggered his anxiety, and he could feel Gunnar shifting into alert position beside his chair, the dog's training kicking in as he sensed his handler's stress levels rising. "Sir, this is a service dog, not a pet. He's legally allowed to be here under the Americans with Disabilities Act." Walsh crossed his arms and stepped closer to the table, his voice getting louder as he sensed an audience. "Look, buddy, I don't care what kind of sob story you've got. Dogs belong outside, not in a restaurant where people are trying to eat. This is a high-end establishment." Marcus pulled out his wallet and showed Walsh the service dog certification card, along with his disabled veteran identification and Gunnar's medical training documentation. "Sir, Gunnar is trained to detect anxiety attacks and provide medical assistance. He's not bothering anyone, and he has the legal right to be here." Walsh barely glanced at the documentation before waving it away dismissively, his gesture drawing more attention from other diners who were beginning to murmur among themselves. "I've seen those fake cards before. Every veteran thinks they can bring their pet anywhere by claiming it's a service animal. Half of you are probably faking your disabilities anyway. This is a high-end establishment, not some military mess hall where you can do whatever you want." That's when Marcus realized that this wasn't about restaurant policy or health regulations. This was about a civilian who decided that veterans were trying to get special treatment they didn't deserve, and he was going to make a public example of someone he saw as a faker exploiting the system. What Walsh didn't notice was the table of 4 Marines in civilian clothes who'd been quietly eating dinner near the window, or the way their conversation had stopped when they heard a restaurant manager disrespecting a fellow Marine and his service dog. These weren't just any Marines, they were members of Alpha Company, 2nd Battalion, 2nd Marines, Marcus's old unit, and they recognized their former squad leader even in civilian clothes. The first sign that Walsh had made a tactical error came when Corporal James Torres stood up from his table and walked over to Marcus's corner booth. Torres was 23 years old, built like a linebacker, and had the kind of respectful bearing that comes from understanding military hierarchy and the debt he owed to the man sitting in front of him. "Staff Sergeant Rodriguez. Corporal Torres, 2nd MEF, Alpha Company. I served under you in Helmand Province, 2018 deployment." Marcus looked up with surprise and growing relief, recognizing the young Marine who'd been part of his squad during some of the heaviest fighting in their sector. "Torres. Jesus, what are you doing here?" "Same thing you are, Staff Sergeant. Trying to enjoy a meal after a long week of field exercises." Torres turned to face Walsh with the kind of focused attention that makes smart civilians nervous, his posture shifting subtly into the alert stance that comes from combat training. "Sir, Staff Sergeant Rodriguez is a decorated combat veteran who was medically discharged after an IED explosion damaged his hearing and gave him traumatic brain injury. Gunnar is a certified service animal who's trained to provide medical assistance for PTSD episodes." Walsh crossed his arms, clearly irritated by the interruption and annoyed that his authority was being questioned by what he saw as more military troublemakers. "Look, son, I don't care about your military club or your war stories. This is a private business, and I have the right to refuse service to anyone. Dogs don't belong in restaurants, period. Actually, sir, you don't have the right to discriminate against disabled veterans. That's federal law, specifically the Americans with Disabilities Act." The second Marine, Sergeant Mike Santos, had approached during the conversation and was now recording everything on his phone while his two companions maintained overwatch from their table. "Sir, I'm documenting this interaction for the base legal office and the local ADA compliance officer. Just so you know, we're keeping an accurate record of this conversation." Walsh's face flushed red as he realized the situation was escalating beyond his control, but instead of backing down, he doubled down on his authority. "Are you threatening me? Because I can call the police and have all of you removed for trespassing and harassment. I don't care how many medals you think you have." "No, sir," Torres replied calmly, his voice carrying the kind of controlled respect that Marines use when dealing with civilians who don't understand military culture. "We're just having dinner and making sure our former squad leader is treated with the respect he earned serving this country. But if you call the police, they're going to ask you to explain why you're violating federal disability law." Meanwhile, Santos was typing rapidly on his phone, sending messages to the group chat that connected most of the Marines from their battalion. The messages were simple but effective: Romano's Steakhouse. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez being hassled for his service dog. Manager threatening to kick him out. Need backup. The second surprise came when Walsh, instead of backing down or consulting with his corporate management, decided to escalate the situation by calling the police anyway. Within 10 minutes, 2 Onslow County Sheriff's deputies arrived at Romano's to investigate a complaint about disruptive veterans, who were threatening staff and refusing to leave. Deputy Sarah Mitchell was a 20-year veteran of law enforcement who'd handled hundreds of restaurant disputes, but something about this call felt different. The complainant had been agitated on the phone, talking about military troublemakers and fake service dogs, which raised red flags for an officer who'd seen enough real service animals to know the difference and who had 2 brothers currently serving in the Army. "Sir, what seems to be the problem here?" Deputy Mitchell asked Walsh, while her partner, Deputy Johnson, assessed the scene with the practiced eye of someone who'd learned to read situations quickly. "These military guys are trying to bring a dog into my restaurant and threatening me when I told them it was against health codes. They're being disruptive and scaring my other customers." Deputy Mitchell looked around the restaurant, noting that the other diners seemed more interested in the confrontation than frightened, and that Marcus was sitting quietly with Gunnar lying calmly beside his chair in the perfect heel position that indicated professional training. "Sir, may I see your service dog documentation?" Marcus handed over Gunnar's certification, his veteran ID, his medical discharge papers, and a letter from his VA therapist explaining Gunnar's role in his treatment plan. Deputy Mitchell examined them carefully while Walsh fidgeted impatiently, clearly expecting the police to immediately side with his version of events. "Mr. Walsh, this is a legitimate service animal with proper documentation from the Veterans Administration. The ADA requires you to allow service dogs in your establishment. I don't care what some federal law says. This is my restaurant, and I set the policies. These guys are just trying to get special treatment." Deputy Johnson, who'd been quietly observing the interaction and listening to radio chatter from dispatch, stepped forward with a concerned expression. "Sir, actually, you do have to care what federal law says. Violating the Americans with Disabilities Act is a federal crime, and the fines can be substantial. But we've got a bigger problem developing." The third surprise came when Deputy Mitchell's radio crackled with a call from dispatch. "Unit 247, be advised you have approximately 50 military personnel requesting permission to enter the establishment to check on their fellow service member. Numbers are growing rapidly." Deputy Mitchell looked out the restaurant window to see a growing crowd of Marines in civilian clothes gathering in the parking lot, their numbers increasing as more vehicles arrived from the direction of Camp Lejeune. Word had spread through the base about what was happening at Romano's, and Marcus's former battalion was responding the way Marines always respond when one of their own is under attack. "Mr. Walsh," Deputy Mitchell said carefully, noting the disciplined way the Marines were organizing themselves in the parking lot, "I think you might want to reconsider your position here. These aren't troublemakers, these are active duty Marines who served with Staff Sergeant Rodriguez." Walsh peered out the window and went pale as he realized that his simple restaurant dispute had somehow escalated into a gathering of what looked like half the Marine Corps. "What do they want?" "They want to make sure their former squad leader is treated with respect," Torres explained. "Staff Sergeant Rodriguez led us through 3 combat deployments. He brought every one of us home alive. When someone disrespects him, we take it personally." Deputy Johnson was receiving more radio updates. "Unit 247, we now have over 100 military personnel on scene. They're maintaining good order and discipline, but the crowd is still growing. Requesting supervisor response." "Mr. Walsh," Deputy Mitchell said, "you've got 2 choices here. You can allow Staff Sergeant Rodriguez to finish his dinner in peace, or you can explain to a couple hundred Marines why you think their combat leader doesn't deserve basic courtesy." The 4th surprise came when Colonel Patricia Williams, commanding officer of the 2nd Marine Expeditionary Force, walked into Romano's wearing her dress blue uniform and an expression that suggested she was not having a pleasant Friday evening. She'd been at a change of command ceremony when her aide informed her that one of her decorated combat veterans was being harassed at a local restaurant, and she'd decided that this situation required personal attention. "Gentlemen, ladies," she announced to the restaurant, her voice carrying the kind of command presence that makes everyone stop what they're doing and pay attention. "I'm Colonel Williams, commanding officer of Camp Lejeune. I understand there's been some confusion about military personnel and service animals." Walsh looked like he was beginning to understand that he'd stumbled into something much larger than a simple restaurant dispute, but he was too committed to his position to back down gracefully. "Colonel, this is a private establishment. I have the right to set my own policies about animals in my restaurant. Mr. Walsh, you have the right to run your business according to federal law. You don't have the right to discriminate against disabled veterans or violate the Americans with Disabilities Act." Colonel Williams approached Marcus's table and extended her hand with genuine respect. "Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, I've heard about your service record and your sacrifice. Thank you for your service to our Corps and our country." She turned back to Walsh with the kind of command presence that makes civilians reconsider their life choices. "Mr. Walsh, let me explain something about the Marines gathering in your parking lot. They're not here to cause trouble or intimidate anyone. They're here because Staff Sergeant Rodriguez led them through 3 combat deployments in some of the most dangerous territory in Afghanistan and brought them home alive. When someone disrespects him, they take it personally." Through the restaurant windows, everyone could see the parking lot filling with Marines, their numbers continuing to grow as more units arrived from the base. They stood in loose formations, talking quietly among themselves, but their presence was unmistakable. "These Marines have seen real combat, Mr. Walsh. They've lost friends in battle, they've been wounded defending American interests, and they've sacrificed years of their lives serving their country. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez was responsible for keeping them alive and bringing them home to their families." Colonel Williams paused, letting her words sink in while Walsh began to understand the magnitude of what he triggered. "Now," she continued, "you have 2 choices. You can apologize to Staff Sergeant Rodriguez and allow him to finish his dinner in peace, or you can explain to my Marines why you think their former squad leader doesn't deserve basic courtesy." The 5th and final surprise came when Walsh, faced with the choice between admitting he was wrong or confronting 200 angry Marines, chose a third option that demonstrated exactly why civilians shouldn't try to outmaneuver military personnel. "I'm calling my lawyer," Walsh announced, pulling out his phone with shaking hands. "This is harassment and intimidation. I'm being threatened by the military." "Sir," Deputy Mitchell interjected patiently, "you called us. We responded to your complaint about a disabled veteran with a service dog. Nobody is harassing or threatening you. These Marines are on public property exercising their right to peaceful assembly." Walsh dialed his attorney's number and began explaining the situation in increasingly agitated terms, there are hundreds of soldiers surrounding my restaurant. No, I don't know what they want. They're saying I have to serve someone with a dog. Their commanding officer is here in uniform. While Walsh was on the phone, arguing with his lawyer about federal disability law and military regulations, Colonel Williams made a decision that would turn a restaurant dispute into a legendary Marine Corps story. Corporal Torres passed the word to the parking lot. The battalion is invited to join Staff Sergeant Rodriguez for dinner. Romano's is apparently large enough to accommodate all of us. Torres grinned and headed for the door, followed by Santos and the other Marines who'd been part of the original confrontation. Within minutes, Marines began filing into Romano's in groups of 10 and 15, filling every available table and booth while maintaining the kind of disciplined order that comes from years of military training. They studied menus, ordered drinks, and engaged in the kind of casual conversation that happens when warriors gather to socialize. The restaurant staff, initially overwhelmed, quickly adapted to serving what was rapidly becoming the largest single-night customer count in Romano's history. Walsh emerged from his phone call to find his restaurant filled with nearly 200 Marines who were politely requesting service while his waitstaff scrambled to accommodate them. His lawyer had explained, in terms that couldn't be misunderstood, that he was legally required to serve the disabled veteran and his service dog, and that refusing service to active duty military personnel would create additional legal problems. "Colonel, this is impossible. We can't serve this many people. Our kitchen isn't equipped for this volume. Mr. Walsh, these are United States Marines. They're very patient, very polite, and they tip extremely well. I suggest you accommodate them." Colonel Williams gestured toward the Marines who were settling into their tables with remarkable efficiency. They've eaten MREs in combat zones and field rations during training exercises. I think they can handle whatever your kitchen can provide. Marcus Rodriguez sat in his corner booth, watching his former battalion fill the restaurant around him while Gunnar remained calm and alert at his side. What had started as an attempt to enjoy a quiet dinner had become a demonstration of the bonds that connect Marines long after their active duty ends. The waitstaff, initially panicked by the sudden influx of customers, quickly discovered that Marines were ideal restaurant patrons. They ordered efficiently, didn't complain about wait times, and treated the servers with respectful courtesy. More importantly, they were patient with the overwhelmed kitchen staff and understanding about the challenges of serving so many people simultaneously. The evening's final surprise came when Walsh, faced with the choice between serving 200 Marines or explaining to his corporate bosses why he turned away the largest customer group in restaurant history, made the pragmatic decision to embrace what was clearly going to be a very profitable evening. "Staff Sergeant Rodriguez," Walsh said, approaching the corner table with obvious reluctance and a newfound understanding of his situation, "I apologize for the misunderstanding about your service dog. Your meal tonight is complimentary, and I hope you'll continue to visit our restaurant." Marcus looked around at the Marines who'd responded to support a brother they respected, then at the restaurant manager who'd learned an expensive lesson about military values and federal law. "Mr. Walsh, I appreciate the gesture, but I'd prefer to pay for my meal. What I want is for you to understand that service dogs aren't pets, veterans aren't trying to scam anyone, and respect isn't something you give when it's convenient." He gestured toward Gunnar, who was lying quietly beside the table, alert but calm. "This dog saved my life. Not in combat, he saves it every day by helping me function in a world that sometimes feels hostile to people like me. When you question his right to be here, you're questioning my right to participate in normal civilian life." 3 hours later, Romano's Steakhouse had served the largest single-night revenue in its corporate history, with nearly 200 Marines demonstrating that military precision extends to restaurant etiquette. They ordered efficiently, ate quietly, cleaned up after themselves, and left tips that averaged 30%. Walsh spent the evening learning about military culture from customers who patiently explained the difference between entitled civilians and veterans who'd earned their rights through service and sacrifice. He learned about IEDs and PTSD, about service dogs and medical discharges, about the bonds that connect Marines across generations and deployments. And Marcus Rodriguez finished his steak dinner surrounded by Marines who'd proven that brotherhood doesn't end with discharge papers, it extends to anyone who needs support, whether they're facing enemy fire in Afghanistan or restaurant discrimination in North Carolina.